Ukraine, what happens after the war? By living ironically in Europe. This guy makes really good videos. He has a good style, similar humor to mine. And he's been popping off lately. He's 500k already. Holy. He was like a few thousand before when I like first saw his videos. But I guess like more videos he does is like popping each other out. So he just blows stuff out of nowhere.
Devastated cities,
Just like
millions of
how everyone
refugees,
does.
tens of thousands.
Exponential scales up.
It's been over 4 years since the full-scale war in Ukraine broke out. The war isn't just a conflict between two countries. It became
He's forming like world stuff, kind of like internet historian, but more like Europe and like maybe Eastern Europe.
the largest war in Europe since World War II, reshaping military alliances, economies, and the future of an entire continent. And while the
Maybe he
fighting
got an
continues
editor
today,
too, but this is
history
because this
tells
is
us that every war eventually ends.
this looks higher
question
quality,
is, what
this video.
happens next? After years of fighting, the front
Like
lines
he
have changed surprisingly
got an
little.
editor.
Although recent news reports came out with Ukraine hitting the Russian core with drone attacks and possibly shifting the tide in its favor, the battlefield has mostly remained the same. It's looking like neither side is willing to throw in the towel anytime soon. But the war will eventually end. Whatever its outcome ends up being, Ukraine and Europe as a whole will change forever. Thus, I'd like to explore the four possible outcomes of the
What if they
Russo-Ukrainian war
split Ukraine in
and how
two
its
at the
consequences
river?
will shape Ukraine's future.
Have like a Western and Eastern Ukraine. No, no forever war,
The
please,
first scenario
speed,
is
I
the
don't need
simplest, and
this.
perhaps the most tragic. Nothing changes. In this outcome, the war of attrition as we know it today continues for many more years to come, despite the numerous harsh
I mean,
sanctions
this is
implemented against
already super bad for both of the sides. Like, so many adult mayors. It's like last generation again. It's like so many died, and it's like most of the countries got knocked down dozens of years
Russia
already.
by the West. The country was able to adapt and focus its economy on its growing state military-industrial complex. Russia has continued to be an energy exporter. At the same time, to replace the trade deficits with Europe, they've increased their trade with China, Iran, and North Korea, which has made Russia very capable at waging war against Ukraine.
What
at a
about
steady
China?
rate.
If China would say like, okay, it's enough, we are ending it, I'm not helping anyone, China could end it, but they are profiting it. They are like a
As
third
things
party.
currently stand, neither side in the war is able to make a breakthrough, despite the Russian government's best
I
efforts.
watched a bunch
in
of like
trying to
videos like summarizing. I saw one today or yesterday summarizing how the front line moves. It didn't move in the last
sell the
3
invasion
years.
of Ukraine as some great patriotic fight
Barely
against
moved.
Nazism and saving the Russian-speaking populace against Ukrainian tyranny. Morale in Russia has relatively remained low. Its
And, like,
main
90% of the fucking like Ukrainians don't even care about this like Russian nationality or whatever. It's like, I feel like it's a super like right wing that cares, like, oh, save us, Russia, save us.
conscripts consist of economic
People just want to live. They don't fucking care.
provinces and minority communities who, instead of
Maybe it's
fighting
the
for
old boomers
glory
that
of
care.
the motherland, are waging war for a paycheck. Large-scale mobilization remains unpopular within the country. The vast majority of Russians, although supporting the war, are against mass mobilization. As things stand, Russia has suffered heavy
I have
casualties.
an idea. My idea. Russian males are disappearing. Females are gonna need males. I'm moving to Russia. Max win.
With over 1 million
Bye.
soldiers killed
They all
or
want me.
injured. Similarly to the rest of the developed world and transitional economies, the country suffers with its
same with
demographic
Japan.
picture. Since 1993, the
Japan
nation's
needs to
population
breed.
has been in decline. Its
Not
fertility
enough
rate
people
is
are born.
well below the replacement level at 1.4 children per woman. Throwing even more of its citizens into the meat grinder would only make things worse, further weakening its economy, ability to provide social services, and leave the country more vulnerable in case of another military conflict. At the same time, Ukraine's demographic and economic situation is much grimmer. In 1991,
Yeah, Ukraine
Ukraine's
just wants
population numbered
to
51
1991 it was 50 million and now it's only like 28? No shot. What happened, Clueless? What is... This is such a bad scare, man. Why is it 24? So this is 20... This is 20... What the fuck is this scale? In-game, 25. So is this the war? This is the first war and second war. No way this amount of people. Oh, they fled the country, that's why.
million. However, in 2023, it was estimated to be 33 million, dropping 1/3 in 3 decades. Meanwhile, its fertility rate is 1.1 births per woman. Millions of Ukrainians have fled abroad with the
1.1.
eruption of this conflict. This, alongside
You
the
need
vast
at least 2
destruction of its infrastructure and
keep up the
industry by
population.
Russia, has made the country's economy extremely vulnerable. As a result, Ukraine's capabilities to defend itself are heavily reliant on the support of its NATO allies. Even though Russia is still sustaining higher casualties on the battlefield, theoretically, it could opt to continue waging a
Ukraine
war
has
of
less
attrition.
population, that's
Based
all
on
that
numbers
matters.
alone, this strategy favors Russia as Ukraine can't keep up the same level of
It hurts them
resistance
more.
over time due to its resource limitations. Even so, if the forever war
Percentile
scenario
might
comes to
be the
fruition,
same for both of
Ukraine
them,
would
but
transition into trying to balance its resources on fighting and
Ukraine has
rebuilding
less
at
to
the same
start with.
time as we're seeing happening now. Emigration from the country would continue. Its economy and welfare system, as a result, would be particularly in danger
This is-
with
this is 100% he hired an editor. Previously he just made a video, add 1 or 2 clips, talk about something, then cut to himself, he talks a bit, then back to the clips a bit, then talks to him. We don't even see his face at all. This is like a serious, high effort video.
for social services being redirected to its defense. This would make its pensioners and war veterans especially vulnerable, as the state wouldn't be able to sufficiently pay them out. The living standard in Ukraine would eventually decline as its society becomes exhausted. The country would become increasingly more reliant
Is there
on
like a
Western support.
future?
If
Like if
Russia's
it ends today, the war, they are still fucked.
frequency of attacks were to continue at the same level, lifting martial law
It
and
might be like-
holding elections would become
It might take
very
like
unlikely.
2030 to
The
be
country
like
would be stuck in limbo. This
decent.
could become extremely problematic for Ukraine as political nuance would slowly deteriorate. Economic hardship could slow reforms and increase opportunities for corruption and political instability. And in the worst case scenario,
send the homeless
civil
man to
war.
war.
Even if the intensity of attacks were to decrease and resemble somewhat of a situation that two were found
I don't
between
know. If you are homeless, can you just like... Sure, if you are homeless and you want, you can go to war still, it doesn't matter. That's like a job. They'll pay you.
2015
Maybe
and
they
2021,
need some mental
the situation
sanity
would
check
still
or
go
whatever,
in Russia's
but-
favor. The conflict would keep Ukraine out of the EU and NATO, de facto
Should be
reluctantly
fine.
putting the nation under Russia's influence. The Kremlin would seek to hold the status quo until the Ukrainian leadership was exchanged with another that would be more willing to make concessions. Essentially, we'd have a repeat of
Surely he's gonna talk about this, that Russia doesn't want Ukraine to join the war. I'm literally Hassan. Because if they do, like, if they do, NATO and Europe like moves more to Russia. So this is like Belarus, so it would be like this. They're already fucked that Sweden and Finland joined. That's like a big loss for them, especially if Finland, because that's more border. But if Ukraine moves, the more you move to east, the more like it's like a flat land. And you can just rush through it. Or is it the other way? No. Yeah, because it's like, it's mountainous here, but after like this line, it's like kind of full flat, and you just, European step, you just rush through it.
NATO
Something
de
like that.
facto rely on concessions.
Just similarly like Napoleon, World War II, that like once you break through that mountain range, it's like full flat and you just rush in. Nothing
Essentially,
defending
we'd
it.
have a repeat of the Georgian situation with the country stuck in perpetual conflict for decades until a lesser hardliner would concede to Russian interests. A saving grace in this scenario would
And like
be
this just makes slowly like every neighboring country to Russia, they slowly like more to join the European Union and join NATO. Like more and more countries are like, I want to join. Please let us in so we don't get fucked.
a change in Russian
Eventually.
leadership. Either Putin dying or the government somehow ousting him and replacing him with a
A lot
more
of like, I don't know, Georgian, Armenian or whatever countries want to join too, but these are like, they have oil and Russia doesn't want
leader. Naming his
to
policy
leave
regarding the
their
war
sphere.
would be complete speculation with no real way of knowing. Meanwhile, Ukraine wouldn't lose overnight. It would slowly bleed economically, demographically, and politically.
Frozen. Wait, what's the difference between the Frozen and Forever War? Oh, is it like South and North Korea?
The next scenario is the frozen conflict case. In this outcome,
They
Russia
have like the current front line and like, okay, that's it on the map, but they are still technically a war.
and Ukraine come to some sort of truce that ends most of the fighting, but do not come up with any proper peace deal. The front line as we know it freezes with Russia staying in control of 20% of Ukraine's territory. Neither
This is also the problem, like, this is like 4 counties. You see the outline, and it's like, oh, here Russia wants all of them. This fight too, it's like complete control. But here, like Ukraine, like gets back and like they gain. So it's like, if Ukraine gives up these 4 counties, it like gives like almost like a half full to them, like because this overwide comes to them. This, okay, they regain these small territories, but it's like nothing. Maybe if it would be like Russia controls like this top part, maybe then the deal is like fine because we get this back.
Ukraine nor the West recognize these lands as a part of Russia, but they de facto become such.
If Russia
Military
breaks
West
through all of these like county lines, then they can make a deal. But if they break through it, then you just continue to go because then it's easier.
Recognize these lands as a part of Russia, but they de facto
And also none of them want peace, like delay, because it's like, what's the word for it? They don't want like a temporary peace or whatever, like that they make a deal like, okay, for 2 months we're not shooting each other. They don't want that, because in the 2 months, each of the sides can like make a bunch of like barricade and make trenches, and then the front line never moves.
become such.
That's the problem
Militarization
now,
of both
because
sides
Russia already
continues.
trenched
Both
up.
sides would pour in tremendous resources in
So Ukraine cannot
fortifying
really
and
push
arming
back
their
because it's
sides on
already
the front
trenched
line.
back.
Ukraine's military spending would continue to take out a large chunk of its
Apparently
GDP.
they have some
Because
giga
of past
trenches.
events like the Minsk agreements, Ukraine would expect Russia to violate the truce at some point in the future, as it did in 2022, and launch another.
Problem is, even if there is a peace, it's like, and Ukraine doesn't join like the European Union or NATO, the war is gonna continue after like, there is a peace and 10 years later it continues again. The third war.
Invasion. Russia, on the other hand, would use Ukraine's militarization as a propaganda tool, arguing that Ukraine is arming itself
This is
in
what he's
preparation
talking
to
about.
attack the Federation, which in turn would lead to Russia also stationing more soldiers and fortifications on its
Eventually
borders.
it
The situation in
sense
the
again.
region would be akin to one in Korea, both sides in an arms race with occasional provocations and border skirmishes. Although better than a continuous war
At least
waging
in
on for
Korea,
years.
the south is giga more militarized, so surely North Korea is not gonna do anything. Look at this. They are still like wearing like Cold War shit and they are like fully geared up, mugging them. This is like one of the rare times that they like actually met, like checked each other's outfit or whatever.
Skirmishes. Although better than a continuous war waging on for years with no end in sight, the atmosphere
Well, one other stuff that I'm like thinking of, on YouTube, if you upload videos and it has like songs, 90% of the times you have a song blocked in like countries. And what's the country? It's Russia and Belarus because of the war. The YouTube music artists like blocking their music on those countries so they can't listen to it or whatever. If the war ends, that's gonna unlock, and finally I'm not gonna get copyrighted.
in Ukraine would still be
The
quite
fucking
bleak.
alert is gonna
A
be
truce
gone,
as is
finally.
would be an extremely hard sell to the public.
Surely.
Morale to keep on defending the country is still high. in
Every time I
Ukraine.
upload a video and I get the alert that video is not available in a few countries because of the music, I check it and I'm, oh my god, why? Where? No, I have to fix it, and it's Russia.
Additionally, much of the public would see the death.
Sometimes it's Greenland, sometimes it's like Norway or whatever, because they have like one song that they have been banned for some reason.
Hundreds of thousands of its countrymen for
It's like
naught.
making
As such,
fun
accepting the
of
current state
that
of
country
the
or
borders
whatever.
would be extremely unpopular and would very likely destabilize the country. It's very possible that a variety of different investigations would be launched against Zelensky and his cabinet when it comes to the handling of the war and some notorious events such as why the country wasn't prepared better for the invasion, why
But he wasn't the president for like 10 years before the war. He just barely got the presidency. Like, he's not really to blame, no? He was president for like 1 or 2 years, I don't know. Why didn't they prepare more? Because the previous guys didn't prepare. What can I do?
Mariupol wasn't evacuated.
They were always fucked before his presidency.
How come the Russians were able to take over Kherson
There was always
so
like
quickly
riots
in the
in
beginning?
Ukraine.
And how did the former energy minister escape his arrest for embezzlement? To name a few. In the soon-to-be elections after the truce is declared, Zelensky would most likely lose. In the last days
Or
in
step
cabinet,
down.
it's likely that the ruling administration would focus on protecting themselves against the war handling.
Well, they can hope
investigation.
here that they get a guy that's like super European friendly, European leading, and that guy wins. I guess that's the one. But it's most likely, if there is a guy like that, he's gonna win.
Public
Just be like more West leading and you are winning the election.
anger could fuel the rise of extremist nationalist parties potentially led by war veterans
Somewhat
who witnessed the
anti-Russian
horrors of war
statement.
firsthand. Already, General Valery Zaluzhny, the commander of the armed forces, garnered a decent amount of popularity before being replaced in 2024. Another figure to look out for would be Vitaly Klitschko, who served as a popular opposition leader in the country prior to the full-blown invasion. It's even possible that the West would be blamed for not helping out enough, which could garner some Euroscepticism and in turn strengthen
Alright.
Russia's narrative. But the vast majority of the blame would still be put on Russia. When it comes to Ukraine's
Then just-
economy, things
Make a montage of Trump complaining about Biden sending money to Ukraine, and it's like, oh, Biden, so much guns for free.
wouldn't be looking that much
You
better.
can't really blame
Although
the
country's
West.
economy will see some growth with no more active fighting taking place, public spending on defense would still remain high.
But they can blame China. Like, it's
This in
China,
turn
the
would funnel
mastermind.
resources away from other public goods like education, healthcare, and transportation infrastructure. Foreign investors would still be wary of bringing their capital into the country
Because
out of
China is not
fears
blockading
of another
Russia.
invasion sometime in the future. All of this in turn would contribute to more people leaving the country due to worsening conditions, which would just snowball and worsen Ukraine's economic.
I mean, yeah, that's true too. Because if the war ends, they kind of like open the borders, and then more people will just get out. Because now the borders are open, but I feel like you can only leave if you are not a male that can go to war. So like every male that's like 16 to 40, they cannot leave the country at all.
Economic recovery even more. The west of Ukraine would lead its politics and economy as most of the people who remain in the country or
If you
choose
can
to
get-
come back would most likely resettle there due to its geographic
Also,
security.
that if you can get not incrafted, I don't know what's the word.
The East, on the other hand,
Born
would
into
see
war,
increased emigration
and you
and far
can't
less
leave.
investment due to its proximity to Russia. One of the biggest determining factors in this scenario would be the West's position on both countries. Whether or not Europe and America would continue to supply Ukraine with weapons and equipment, on what scale, and whether or not sanctions would be lifted on Russia. As I mentioned before,
if Trump would have lost, that would have been a big win for Ukraine, because Trump is like, he's making the deal, is
for the vast
money
majority of
first.
Ukraine's fighting capabilities come from the support of its
He sells the
allies.
weapon, but
to
he
develop its
wants
security in
stuff in
preparation of
return,
another attack, the
like
West would need
resources.
to increase its supplies to the country. The United States under the Trump administration has not been the most reliable partner, going back and forth when it
Yeah,
comes
Biden was like closed eyes and just like, signing stuff for free,
to its security
not even
guarantees.
looking.
So to combat this,
Oh,
Europe
10
would need to
nuclear
take a
warheads
more
to Ukraine?
proactive
Okay.
role in Ukraine's defense. Depending on the truce's
Boot up the
terms
auto
and
pen.
Europe's appetite for expanding its influence, we could see European peacekeeping troops stationed in Ukraine, similarly to the situation in
Check.
Bosnia or Kosovo. It's also uncertain what the West's policy regarding Russia would be. Even though hard Russian allies like Hungary's Viktor Orban are no
He's
longer
here.
active in deciding
Whatever political video you watch, he's gonna be here.
the EU's policy on the war, we could
I
still
saw fucking TikTok, it's like the next European president or whatever, and he was one of the 5 guys they
expect
listed
some countries
that can run
like
for it.
Slovakia to lift some sanctions and reinstate trade with Russia. Despite the EU taking a nominally hard stance against the country, the Union still continues
And they are
to
like,
import gas
suck it
from
one G in
Russia
him,
4
but he's
years
so,
after the
so
war.
good. He has to
13%
lead
of all
Europe.
natural gas is supplied by them. Although the bloc agreed to
Suck it
cease
one
all
G, suck
imports
it
by
one G.
2027, we could see a return by at least some countries to this source of energy due to it being cheaper. Germany under Merkel took a more lax approach to Russia, arguing that economic reliance on the country would deter it from future conflict.
Didn't they make
Even
the
after the
gas
invasion
line
of Crimea in
during
2014,
Merkel?
construction on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline continued, and the West gladly participated in the 2018 World Cup in Sochi, Russia. A renewed trade with the country would dictate its capabilities of waging war in Ukraine in the future.
Insane to think about
and in
the World
turn,
Cup was there.
Ukraine's defense buildup. Joining the EU on its single market would be of tremendous help to Ukraine's financial situation. It's possible that in this scenario, we also see an expedited
Also, the two
process
flags
of
look
Ukraine
cool. It's
joining
blue,
the
blue.
Union. However,
Same
we could
colors.
also see the opposite. The EU has not been able to come to a consensus regarding accepting new members. The Western Balkans have been waiting for almost 2 decades to join. Some politicians within the EU have argued that this would be unfair for them, as Ukraine still has a very long way to go in battling corruption and implementing reforms.
Didn't they
This
speed
battle
up some... There are like 2 countries that got sped up recently to join. Like, I don't know, Bosnia and Albania or whatever.
would be even
Montenegro.
more difficult if its economy and living standard remain low due to
I know Ukraine got the first pass finally. Because Cinema Guy approved it finally. And yeah, it was approved their first like step to join the European Union. But they are discussing if they should have like a sped up process or not. I feel like it's normal process, just as everyone. No speeding up. It's gonna take 10 years and it's not sped up, but they can speed it up.
spending in anticipation of another
It's fair
attack.
to like
In
everyone
many
gets the
ways,
same
a
process.
frozen conflict
no
would be
matter
the
what.
worst of both worlds. The bombs may stop falling,
Or maybe
but
like
Ukraine
some very small points could get sped up, but I don't know
would still
exactly
be forced
what's
to prepare
needed.
for the next invasion while trying to rebuild from the last one. Billions would continue flowing into defense instead of schools, hospitals,
Oof,
and
that's-
infrastructure. Investors would remain cautious, refugees would hesitate to return, and politics would continue to revolve
It kind of
around
looks like what they have to do. Just fully like give up the country after the war and like be like, okay, NATO, we join NATO, and NATO can just build up this country as a fortress.
national security. The war would no longer dominate headlines,
Iron
but would
Curtain
remain shaping every aspect of Ukrainian society.
But what in exchange you give up every like resource you have and you are like just fucked anyway.
The third scenario would be Ukraine's victory. In this outcome, Ukraine is able to make a breakthrough on the front line, pushing all the way.
Maybe if they make a breakthrough, maybe it happens the same as like on the north, that like they make push and the Russians just all give up. Okay, fuck it. Too much loss.
To its pre-2022 borders. In an extremely optimistic scenario, it's able to restore control over all of its territory it controlled before 2014. This ending would be extremely reliant on
what happens here if they win? Do they get back Crimea? I guess not.
Factors: increased Western support and Russian
That's the max win if they get
As I mentioned
Crimea
before,
back to.
Ukraine's ability to fight is highly reliant on the supplies its allies provide. Currently, both Russia and Ukraine are stuck in a stalemate that slightly...
This is just fucked up word. Why can't we all be friends? Smile. Why are we killing each other?
Favors Russia. At the moment, Ukraine is mobilizing 30,000 people monthly, while Russia is recruiting roughly 30 to 40,000. To tip the scales on the front, Ukraine would need to be supplied with
it's just wasting money. I guess companies are profiting from this war, and that's all. That's why
opponent. As the war is heavily relying on drone and missile warfare, air defense systems like the Patriot system and the SPAAGs are of crucial importance. Drones and rockets are the #1 cause of casualties for Ukrainian personnel and civilians. To keep up a numerical advantage and high morale, Ukraine would need more defensive equipment. But war isn't just won by defending, one must also go on the attack. To make a successful breakthrough, Ukraine would also need to be supplied with more long-range missiles, artillery, fighter jets, and most important...
I mean... if they get long-range stuff, they have to like what? Start shooting the Russian countries in Russia, Russian cities. And that's kind of what they have to do. That's the only way Russia gives up.
Of all drones, as noted in the beginning.
Enough people riot on the streets.
Beginning of the video, the average Russian's desire to wage war against Ukraine is quite low. But at the same time, their desire to oppose it is also meager. This is mainly due to the fact that Russia's civilians have not majorly felt the effects of war back home. Their everyday life is more or less the same, be it their government bombing Kyiv or not. To make a successful breakthrough on the front, Ukraine would need to increase its attacks against targets deep inside Russia, especially in its tier 1 cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. Developing an indigenous long-range strike capability could be especially effective, as Ukraine would be able to respond proportionally to Russian attacks on its own cities, which could potentially make the Russian government rethink terrorizing Ukrainian residential neighborhoods with missiles.
Back to Russia
Bringing the fighting back home would make many Russians second-guess the regime's decision to keep fighting. Targeting its refineries, ports,
knew that a bunch of drones got to Moscow
recently would also decrease its effectiveness in fighting this war, which could potentially lead to Ukraine achieving a breakthrough on the front and Russia being forced to accept a peace treaty in Ukraine's favor. Some analysts are starting to believe the scenario could prove true, as for most of this summer, in 2026, Ukraine has amped up its attacks on Russian infrastructure in Crimea and the mainland, skyrocketing fuel prices, increasing inflation, and causing many Russians to flee. Many journalists have also reported on rising discontent in the government in Russia over these attacks and the changing rhetoric in how the Kremlin has been reporting on its war. If arms keep flowing to Ukraine and the country is able to keep up attacking the Russian core, we could potentially see a Ukrainian victory. We've seen a similar scenario play out in Yugoslavia, although the Yugoslav war machine seemed unstoppable on its own in Bosnia and Kosovo. After NATO's direct intervention and extensive bombing campaign on Serbia, morale in the country plummeted as its industry, economy, and effects of war could be felt in Belgrade. This led to mass protests and revolution that subsequently ended the war and overthrew Milosevic. It's unlikely that the same scenario would play out in Russia, as mass discontent hasn't deterred the Kremlin against its war efforts so far. But more pressure on the Russian public public could play in Ukraine's
Like a
favor.
leaf
If
field.
Ukraine were able to restore its borders to the pre-2022 level, the country in
Did I
Europe
go live
as a
on
whole would receive a
I'm not live
giant
on Kick.
morale boost. The country could gain
Oh.
confidence to keep on pushing to restore its jurisdiction to
My Kick chat.
pre-2014 levels. Millions of refugees would most likely return back home, although we'd probably see less return to ex-occupied areas out of fear from another
I was
future
doing other
conflict.
stuff and I went
The West
live and
could
I
see the
forgot.
country's victory as promising potential and expedite
I'm not
Ukraine's membership in
multi-streaming
the
anywhere.
EU and NATO, while showering it with security guarantees.
I fix
All
it.
in all, the country would most likely go through a construction boom as investors from abroad would flock like never before. The
Yeah.
country's tourism industry
House.
would also very proudly see a drastic increase as millions were exposed to Ukraine for
Can I
years
stream on
via the
TikTok
coverage
finally?
over its war. Zelensky and his administration would
Or am
be
I
seen
still
as
banned,
heroes
by
in
the
the
way?
West, and his approval ratings would most likely improve back home. Questions of how effectively the war was handled would still remain, but unlike in the previous scenarios, the public could be much more lax regarding prosecuting or even investigating the administration as
I got
it
banned
did
from
defeat
streaming on
one of the
TikTok.
world's greatest military powers
I don't know
as
why.
an under
They didn't give any reason, they just revoke my access.
But the country's
I
problems
see so many random people streaming, why can't I?
wouldn't disappear overnight. The weapons Ukraine procured wouldn't come for free. The nation
I'll
would be
keep
left
getting
with
revoked.
a decent financial debt it would be forced to pay off. Its demographic
Alright, I don't get it. Congrats, you can go live on TikTok. You have been approved. I applied to get approved. I got declined 4 times, now I approved.
would still
Why?
remain bleak, even in the most optimistic case, assuming
Out of
restoration
nowhere,
of
they just
1991
automatically
orders
approved
and
it.
rapid economic recovery. The
Why can't you
population
approve it? Like, put it on a queue, and when I get approved, you approve me. Why do you have to decline? Don't decline me.
is on track to
Just
decline
approve
to
me whenever you
31
can.
million by 2035, even with
Okay.
refugees
You can go
returning.
live on
It's uncertain how the
TikTok.
country would tackle this problem,
Finally.
but we could see increased austerity, Ukraine debasing its currency, and potentially selling off a good chunk of its industry and natural resources to foreign actors,
It
as
should
is
be
the
live
case
on
with the
TikTok.
Ukraine-US Mineral Resources Agreement. Another major issue would be the leftover mines. As it currently stands, mines and other explosives
Miners.
affect around 29%
Send
of
out
the
the
country's
miners
territory
to
and 10%
pick
of
up
its
the
agricultural
mines.
land. Demining would continue to be a major challenge the country would struggle with for decades, similarly in fashion to Bosnia and Cambodia. Several farmers would get injured annually while tending their fields. Despite all the challenges, this would undoubtedly be Ukraine's most optimistic future.
I'm live.
Victory would not erase the demographic crisis, heal the trauma of war, or rebuild
I'm live.
destroyed cities overnight. But
Sorry,
for the
TikTok
first
chat.
time since
I
2022,
forgot about-
Ukraine's future would no longer be the
Sorry, TikTok chat. I was unallowed to stream. We are back.
defined by its survival. Instead,
I
the country's
tried to get the restreaming back 5 times. They declined me. They revoked my access, but we got access again to
greatest
stream.
challenge
So yeah.
would become rebuilding itself economically, politically,
And also we can see
socially.
TikTok
Winning
chat.
the war would not be the end of Ukraine's struggle, but it would finally
W.
give the Ukrainians the opportunity to shape their own future rather than simply fight for it.
I don't have my TikTok listed on the website that I have.
The final scenario is the one Ukraine and its allies have spent years trying to prevent: a Russian victory. In this eventuality, Russia is the one who makes a breakthrough on the front line. Ukraine's armed forces are defeated, and Moscow's military is able to march
What about
to Kyiv
nukes?
and enforce its peace conditions. For this to happen, the West's support for Ukraine dwindles or stops altogether. The US administration under Trump deems supporting the country more trouble than it's worth. The EU is either unable to provide weaponry or stuck in an administration gridlock again due to the emergence of a new
Again.
Orban-like figure. Either way, Ukraine would have to not be able to procure weapons and equipment from from its allies, which would eventually lead them to be overpowered by Russia's domestic military-industrial complex. In Russia's advance across Ukraine, we'd see a massive caravan of refugees fleeing the country
stuff
or
would be-
going to
that would be
western
cool.
Ukraine. A new humanitarian catastrophe would emerge, and Europe would struggle in managing such an
Device.
event. Ukraine's government would likely face an unprecedented legitimacy crisis and tremendously weaken. We could see a lot of its elites and oligarchs also fleeing the country, leaving massive power vacuums in the remaining fragile government. That's not to say that the country as a whole would just lay on its back and let the Russians roll all over them. Resistance against Russian
actually
occupiers
live.
would continue, but it would become much more decentralized. It's very likely that guerrilla fighting would become prominent, with smaller Ukrainian forces trying to catch Russian ones off guard. Many Ukrainians would willingly or unwillingly turn to collaborating with the new Russian government. This would be either by force, ideological belief, or economic desperation. Either way, we could potentially see Ukrainian resistance fighters also targeting them in assassinations or bombing campaigns, as they'd see them as traitors. For a while, the country would be overwhelmed by chaos. In the worst case scenario for Ukraine, Russia would seize more than half of Ukraine's territory while leaving lands west of Kyiv as a rump state.
He's fucking playing Firelink Shrine.
In the remains of Ukraine, a new puppet regime would be put in place by the Kremlin, which would most likely be barred from joining both NATO and the EU, while also being dragged screaming into Russia's sphere of influence. Ukraine would become depopulated as even more people would leave, and the state as we know it today would cease to exist. Initially, the West would likely refuse to recognize these new borders and Russia's legitimacy over Ukrainian territories. Sanctions would remain in place, with even more being dogpiled due to the illegal annexation made by Russia. But that wouldn't change the reality on the ground. It's likely that the situation would be similar to how the West viewed China and Taiwan throughout the 20th century with the two China's one policy system. Over time, some countries might push to normalize relations with
maybe
Russia,
this is
particularly if
Firelink
economic
Shrine.
interests begin to outweigh political considerations. Europe's happy-go-lucky way of life would also change, with Russia expanding its borders and sphere of influence significantly via the use of force. We'd most likely see a wave of rearmament across the continent. The Baltics, Romania, and Poland would become a hotbed of new NATO military bases and hundreds of thousands of more troops securing the border. The EU's government could potentially also become more centralized due to the war exposing bureaucratic inefficiencies within its decentralized system in properly supplying Ukraine with defenses. It's possible a centralized European military force could emerge as a result. When it comes to Ukraine's economy and standard of living, things wouldn't look that great. Millions of its buildings would lie in ruin while its provinces depopulated. Russia would hire its own contractors to rebuild the nation, but considering its own resources have been severely drained and sanctions would remain in place for a while, it's uncertain how effective this would be. Furthermore, Russia is currently keeping its economy afloat due to transitioning into a war economy, but after the war ends, it's questionable if the same economic standard could be kept. We'd also definitely see a Russification program across the newly conquered territories. The Ukrainian language and identity in Russia are seen as illegitimate. Rather than as a separate culture and ethnic group, Ukrainians are viewed as a Russian subgroup. Because of the hostilities that arose from the war, we could see Russian being enforced as the official language in schools and government-led institutions. Ukrainian state and ethnic symbolism could be seen as separatist sentiment and therefore would be highly restricted. We could also see a wave of Russian settlers coming in to sell the depopulated ex-Ukrainian lands, similar in fashion to how the USSR brought ethnic Russians in its minority-led republics in an effort to displace the local population and seize control. A Russian victory would represent far more than Ukraine's defeat. It would fundamentally reshape Europe's security order. Countries along NATO's eastern flank would likely enter a decades-long military buildup, while governments around the world would reassess the value
He's just
of
out of
security
farming, walking
guarantees,
around.
alliances, and even nuclear deterrence. The war may have ended, but a new era of European geopolitics would only just be beginning. Regardless of how
they
the
have
war
pushed
ultimately
way back
ends,
into Europe
one
if
thing
that
is
happens.
certain. Ukraine will face an enormous reconstruction effort that extends far beyond rebuilding its cities and infrastructure. Reconstructing roads, homes, and power plants is relatively straightforward compared to repairing the social fabric
Guess if
of
you're
a
like
nation
a
that has endured
constructor
years
guy,
of
electrician
large-scale
guy, or whatever, you go to Ukraine and you make tons of money because everyone is like rebuilding houses and you have jobs non-stop.
war. The country's greatest
Even in here, like, they always have jobs and they like overcharge by a lot. I don't know how they like always job. You have like, you need to set up a time and they like double the price already.
challenges may prove to be psychological, economic, and demographic.
They have
One of the
jobs, it
least
just matters how
discussed
much
but
they can like
potentially most
mentally take,
significant
how much
long-term
energy they have.
consequences is mental health. Since Russia's full-scale invasion began, Ukraine suffered well over 500,000 military casualties, including an estimated 100,000 to 140,000 fatalities. Tens of thousands of civilians have also been killed, while millions have experienced displacement, occupation, or prolonged missile attacks. Years of witnessing death, injury, torture, and destruction inevitably leave lasting psychological
PTSD.
scars. When the fighting eventually stops, Ukraine is likely to face a mental health crisis unlike
And also
anything in its
like, fighting stops, yeah, years later you're gonna feel like instantly like, oh, the generation is gone. When are the men in the country? Old people died. There's like a big hole in the demographic, and like
modern history. By
It's GG.
2023, roughly 80% of Ukrainians reported experiencing symptoms such as anxiety, depression, or sleep disorders. The World Health
Hope left.
Organization
I'm a Ukrainian,
estimates
I
that
guess.
between 10 and 15
I have all
million
three.
Ukrainians will require some form of mental health care. This figure does not fully account for veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder or family members coping with grief and long-term trauma, should Ukraine also struggle economically after the war. Unemployment and financial insecurity would likely worsen these conditions. The challenge is compounded by the region's limited mental health infrastructure. Across much of Eastern Europe, seeking psychological treatment still carries a social stigma, with many viewing therapy as a sign of shame and or
That's the Max Fin plan. You are studying to become a therapist. You learn Ukrainian, and you go to Ukraine and become a therapist there.
or weakness, rather than a
Max
legitimate
Vin.
form of healthcare. At the same time, Ukraine has a shortage of trained psychologists and psychiatrists relative to the scale of the need. Without substantial investment in treatment and rehabilitation, unresolved trauma could contribute to domestic violence, substance abuse, suicide, and cycles of generational trauma that persist long after the war has ended. Economic recovery presents another daunting obstacle. As a consequence of the war, approximately 7.1 million Ukrainians now live below the poverty line, while millions have lost their homes due to widespread destruction. Around 1 in 10 homes has been damaged or destroyed, disproportionately affecting children and the elderly. The World Bank estimates that the conflict has erased roughly 15 years of economic progress, leaving Ukraine with the difficult task of rebuilding both its infrastructure and its middle class. The economic and psychological pressures
15
could
years.
also threaten social
And
cohesion.
then what?
History shows that veterans returning from prolonged conflict sometimes struggle to reintegrate
And
into
then
civilian
what?
life. While the overwhelming majority successfully do so, those left untreated or unsupported may become
15 million
vulnerable to
today.
criminal organizations or political extremism. Following the Soviet-Afghan War, for example, the Soviet veterans later became involved with organized crime during the turbulent 1990s. Ukraine Ukraine will therefore need effective veteran support programs to reduce the risk of similar outcomes.
Yeah.
The war may also leave behind deep social divisions. Millions of Ukrainians fled abroad to escape the fighting, while others remained to serve in the military or endure a life under constant danger. As soldiers return home, resentment could emerge between those who fought
You
and
can
those who
part
left,
there.
particularly toward military-aged men who avoided service. Although many refugees had legitimate reasons for leaving, such tensions could complicate national reconciliation and create lasting political and social fractures. The conflict has also created humanitarian issues that will outlast the battlefield. Thousands of Ukrainian children were deported or transferred to Russia or Russian
Oh my God,
territories, a practice that has become the subject of international legal.
I could have almost spawned in Ukraine. And then at max loss, I would have been fighting. I guess I got lucky I didn't spawn there. But I didn't spawn in India. Which one is the worst?
Proceedings. Even after a ceasefire, efforts to identify, locate, and return these children are likely to remain a contentious diplomatic and legal issue for years.
I guess
Finally,
I would have like instantly fled like others. Instantly. The second it happens, GG, bye-bye.
Ukraine faces the challenge of rebuilding its next generation.
They are
children
moving to
experienced
Austria,
years of
becoming a
disrupted
dishwasher.
education, first during the COVID pandemic and then because of the war. Schools were destroyed, classes moved online, and millions of students became refugees. One analysis found that during the 2022 to 2023 academic year, nearly half of Ukrainian school-aged refugee children abroad were unable to access their host countries' education systems due to administrative and logistical barriers. The educational setbacks created by these disruptions risk lowering future productivity and slowing Ukraine's long-term recovery. Ukraine's post-war future will therefore be measured by far more than territorial control or economic statistics. The country will have to rebuild its institutions, care for millions suffering from psychological trauma, reintegrate veterans and refugees, recover lost generations of students, and heal divisions
nice job,
created by
Shibez.
years of war. Winning the peace may ultimately prove to be a greater challenge than winning the war itself. Hopefully, the fighting will come to an end soon in Ukraine's favor. Regardless of when that day arrives, the end of the war will mark the beginning of an equally difficult challenge. Rebuilding destroyed cities and infrastructure will require enormous financial investment, but repairing the country's economy, institutions, and social fabric will take far longer. Ukraine will have to care for millions suffering from psychological trauma, address demographic and educational setbacks, and heal the divisions left behind by years of conflict. The war's legacy will therefore be measured not only by the outcome of the battlefield, but by whether Ukraine can successfully rebuild a stable, prosperous, and united nation in the years
They are gonna
follow.
have money flowing in, and other countries are gonna rebuild them. It depends how much the country's identity remains. See, here's a lot of Hungarian donations, Patreons, as one of his parents are from this country. W.